Hello, this is David with Stupid Things People Do and What We Can Learn from Them. Today, I'm here to tell you that HR is your friend. Well, they're supposed to be. Too often, we hear stories about human resource departments that aren't really focused on humanity so much as resources. An HR department like this is functionally little more than a bureaucratic cudgel used to enforce corporate policies and keep the orphans in line. For example, meet Oliver Twist. Not his real name, but with his level of luck, it's an apropos alias. For you see, Oliver Twist had kidney stones. Like, a lot of them. Cystinuria levels, lots of them, and I hope I pronounced that right. So, like most people do, Oliver Twist had a job. Let's call it Mr. Bumble Incorporated. And like most jobs, Bumble Incorporated had an attendance policy. Seemingly a generous one, more of a 7 strikes and you're out versus a 3 strikes and you're out kind of deal. The weird thing is, for some reason, HR decided to count doctors' visits as strikes. So if you guessed that kind of policy would end up with employees collapsed on the ground in indescribable pain, you'd be correct. It turns out ignoring your medical needs to comply with a vapid attendance policy nets you golf ball-sized kidney stones. And that, my dear listeners, is something that the company, in all of its wisdom, discerned a mere day of medical leave should be sufficient for. When, in his greed, Oliver Twist approached Mr. Bumble Incorporate's leadership with an ungrateful plea of, "Please, sir, may I have some more?" Oh, we just got a whole song and dance number about what happens to little employees who ask for more. There's a dark, thin, winding employment action without any banisters, which will throw him down and revoke all of his insurances and 401k. Cutting aside the niche musical references, HR determined that medical leave for a second surgery required to remove the shards of golf ball stone from his kidneys constituted his 7th and final strike. But that's okay, because there was a compromise. They would fire him, and then in accordance with their policy, he could reapply after 60 days. So generous. Unfortunately for them, despite their self-apparent generosity, firing someone doesn't constitute a reasonable accommodation under ADA, regardless of whether you allow that employee to beg for their job back in 60 days. So, circling back, what we have here is a common situation. Oliver Twist is talking to his manager, who is talking to HR, who is then talking to I don't know what. They end up bureaucratically and unthinkingly following policy without considering humanity and make decisions based on rules they've just made up instead of things enshrined in law. So, for example, they considered ADA accommodations to be no-shows. That general attitude Mr. Bumble seemed to hold regarding medical conditions could be best summarized by Oliver's boss's reaction to his accommodations, and I quote, "We already looked out for you once. I'll see what I can do." End quote. As if an ADA accommodation was a favor granted by a generous slumlord instead of a mandate of the law. Speaking of which, ADA trumps policy. So when policy contradicts the ADA, well, that just means the policy's illegal. So obviously, Mr. Bumble Incorporated couldn't defend themselves with policy if, in fact, Oliver had asked for more time and they'd exiled him for it. So they tried to reinterpret his request as one for an indefinite leave of absence, which it wasn't. All that happened was they never asked for how long he'd be gone for. Further, their actions beg the question, if you could afford for him to be gone for 60 days and then allow him to reapply without issue, why terminate him to begin with? Replacing employees is really hard. As mentioned, bureaucratic idiocy, it's just not a defense. So obviously Mr. Bumble Incorporated lost, serves them right, but what can we learn from it? Because, obviously, your HR department, I'm sure, isn't just bumbling along, but that doesn't mean we can't learn things. I think the thing I've been teasing and harping on all episode, for example, is that policy is not a very good defense if, in fact, that policy is illegal. In fact, putting illegal policies into writing, as we've seen in the case of the worst landlord in Las Vegas, it makes things worse, not better. Though, to be clear, and to ward off the lawyers who wait in the eaves like gargoyles, that does not mean you shouldn't have policies, and it does not mean that you shouldn't write them down. It just means that there is a big, bleak line between policies that are legal and help your company and policies that are illegal and thinly veiled attempts to skirt the law. So, for example, having a policy that we violate ADA or having a policy that we institute race quotas in our hiring, That's not going to be very helpful. On the converse side, say for a religious organization, having policies defining the religious organization's beliefs and ministerial roles, well, that can be helpful. So what's the distinction? Well, the religious organization spelling out its religious beliefs in a policy isn't an attempt to skirt the law. It's an attempt to assert the law, in this case, Title VII and constitutional rights. Similarly, you could have policies delineating how your company intends to comply with ADA. Though, even then, you're not going to always be able to do things by that book. As I've mentioned before, talks about accommodations are always a conversation. And you're not going to be able to prescribe everything in a policy. So often, that kind of ADA compliance clause, it's just going to delineate the process of having those conversations, not what can and can't be offered as accommodations. The short, of the very long of it, is that policies are complicated, and they're only as good as the time you put into them. Companies should always seek legal experts proactively to make sure their policies are above board, and they should not be afraid to break from that policy if the law, or common sense, dictates that maybe firing someone for kidney stones is an idiotically bad idea. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.